So my name is Jared Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Michigan Land Conservancy. And today we're going to talk about invasive species, some of the ones you may not be quite aware of, ones that I hope aren't in the area. I'll talk a little bit about what I do for my job and the role of invasive species in my job. And then after we're done, we're going to go out, and I have a goat outside eating some bittersweet right now, and we're going to talk about the management of invasive species with goats. So we'll start off just talking about Mid-Michigan Land Conservancy real quick. Okay, so Mid-Michigan Land Conservancy. So we are a nonprofit. We work in 7 counties in Michigan, and the purpose of our organization is protection of land forever. So we protect land through conservation easements, which we protect private land and keep land in private hands, but we protect the conservation values based on the wishes of the landowner. And currently we protect around 1,800 acres of private land, and we work from Ionia down to Hillsdale County. So we protect about I'd say 1,500 acres or so in conservation easements. And we also own around 425 acres of natural areas that we have to open to the public. So you're welcome to go use them. We actually have a few in Ingham County, and hopefully we'll have one in Eaton County in the future. But right now we have 7 preserves that we operate, and invasive species are a component and a challenge of what we have to deal with on our properties. So invasive species are always present, and we seem to get a lot of them when we receive properties. A lot of them haven't been managed for invasive species. So it's a task that our stewardship crew, which is mostly myself and a few board members, it's a big problem that we have to deal with in all this acreage. So as I said, we do protect land forever through conservation easements and through natural areas that we own and operate. And our main focus is protecting natural areas, but we also protect farmland as well. Those are our 2 focuses, or the farmland and natural areas. And we often get the properties that we own through donations. Sometimes we'll buy them through bargain sales where we buy them for a lower price than the value of the property. And occasionally we'll pursue grants and get funding to actually purchase properties that we can then open to the public. So invasive species are a big deal for us because they lower the biodiversity of our preserves, and we want to have the most biodiversity that we can possibly get on our preserves and keep these invasives off our properties. The picture in the bottom right, that's our Swains Lake Fen in Jackson County. And right now it's looking pretty good, but we do have a bit of buckthorn starting to come in up from the edge of the road. And so we're actually starting to remove the buckthorn off that fen. And it's a very small fen. It's only around 7.5 acres, but there's a lot of high quality plants and natural communities there. So we are focusing on that and removing invasive species. And invasive species are very expensive for us to deal with. It takes a lot of time, a lot of volunteers, a lot of money. So invasive species are a challenge, and they're something that we do manage on our properties. So the invasive definition, essentially it's any species that is from somewhere else that causes harm to the natural area. And that can be human health, the environment, or the economy. And I always try to remind people that invasive species don't really have an agenda. They've just been moved somewhere unnaturally, typically by us, and they cause harm to the environment. So they don't have an agenda. They're simply trying to survive in this new land that they're starting to conquer, but they're not evil plants, they're just trying to survive. And we're concerned with invasive species because, and this is very outdated numbers, but they figure that they cost our economy for control and hiring staff and the management of invasive species almost $140 billion every year. They currently occupy 100 million acres, and they spread by about 1.7 million acres every year. So every year they're spreading about an area the size of Delaware. And we spend billions on different invasive species. Feral hogs do about $4 billion in damage. We are impacted almost $6 billion by invasive species in the Great Lakes Basin. And they typically have some characteristics that make them invasive. There's a reason that when they show up or are introduced, that they harm the natural communities that they invade. And they often have these very interesting characteristics. One of them might be allelopathy. Allelopathy, I always pronounce it differently. That is chemical warfare that plants are using to prevent other plants from growing. Japanese knotweed does this. They think Phragmites might do this as well. But not all invasive plants have this characteristic. Black walnut is an allelopathic plant. They prevent other shrubs and trees from growing around them. One of the big issues that we deal with in Michigan especially is a lot of these invasive species are not a preferred food source by the native animals, especially white-tailed deer. So they'll eat everything else that's native, and they'll leave the invasives, and it gives them a competitive advantage to live in Michigan. It's really one of the biggest problems that we deal with, especially on our preserves. We have too many white-tailed deer. a lot of invasive species, a completely defoliated understory that allows only the invasives to thrive. A lot of times you'll hear about exotic species. These are species from other places, but they don't have any characteristics that cause harm to the natural areas that they inhabit. One would be nilgai, and these are really a big antelope from the Indian subcontinent. They've released these in South Texas. They thrive there. Outside fences, a lot of Texas is fenced up with big game preserves, but these guys actually survive outside the fences in South Texas. And they're really strong animals. They've adapted, along tigers, so they're really tough to hunt. And they were brought over for hunting purposes, but they are not an invasive species because they don't impact the environment. Aoudad or Barbary sheep, those are in Texas as well, New Mexico. There's actually more of aoudad in the United States than in their native homelands in North Africa. And ringneck pheasants, also an exotic species, beloved by sportsmen, on the decline, but they're not invasive because they don't impact the environment. And in fact, we actually have lower populations of pheasants than ever. Noxious weeds is another term you'll hear. This is not always an invasive species. Noxious weeds can be invasive or native. They're just plants that really cause harm or they annoy you. I call them obnoxious weeds because we think of things such as poison ivy, mare's tail, which is a big problem in ag fields right now because they're finding that they're glyphosate resistant. So they're weeds that actually impact our economy. So when we think of noxious weeds, keep in mind that we're talking about plants that can be invasive or native, as you can see by this chart right here. And the reason that we do all this effort and control on invasive species is because they impact biodiversity. And we want biodiversity because the more biodiverse that the habitats are, the more species they can support, the more resilient they are to climate change, disease, invasive species. Think of the ash tree. When we lost all the ash, we lost millions of trees in the forest we lost instantly. A lot of parks used ash trees in cityscapes. When one single borer came in, they were all wiped out. It really impacted our communities. So we really want to manage our forests to have a lot of biodiversity, a lot of different species of trees to adapt to any incoming changes that might be coming, whether invasive diseases, plants, anything that might show up that can harm our forests. So the reason that we also do these education programs on invasive species is so if we find something and we educate the public and there's new invasions, we can find those invasions quicker before they spread. If you look on this map right here, this is my first experience with invasive species in Berrien County. The map on the left is Chinese yam and known sites in Berrien County. There were only 2 of them. We found them quickly. We removed them quickly. The one on the right, that's this garlic mustard in Warren Dunes State Park. So once we find these things early, if we educate the public, we can mitigate the damage and possibly control those invasive species before they become widespread. So we control invasive species in a number of ways. Most common you'll hear is from herbicide treatments. Mechanical removal also works on some species, not for all of them. It can actually make things worse. And we will also use biological control, which can be a problem if we start bringing in a bunch of new species to control invasive species. But we have had success with Galericella beetles on purple loosestrife, and we've had some spotted knapweed biological control that's worked very well out west. All these different methods have advantages and disadvantages. Really, you just want to use the method based on the situation, the type of invasion, and your comfort with using the different methods. We'll talk about goats outside, but goats are a very nice way of removing invasive species because they work for free. All they want to do is eat, and they do a phenomenal job of removing invasive shrubs and vines. I don't recommend doing goats in areas where you have a lot of special native or endangered plants, but in areas that are completely invaded by invasive species, goats do a very good job. For one reason, they have a rumen that has 4 stomachs that actually kill the seeds. They don't spread seeds like birds do, so we don't have to really worry about spreading invasive seeds from goats through their poop. But we have to be careful about what's on their hooves. So when we're done using goats, we want to make sure that they're cleaning their hooves off so we're not moving invasive seeds to other sites. And we'll take you outside in a little bit, and I'll show you my assistant that's out there working on Oriental bittersweet right now. So herbicides, this is a big part of my job when I was a SISMA coordinator. We did a lot of herbicide treatments on invasive species, often very controversial. A lot of negative comments when you're out in the field from the public, which I understand because putting herbicide out in the environment can cause harm. So when we use herbicides, we need to make sure we know what we're doing, we're using them in the right situation, and if you're not comfortable using them, please don't, because you can cause harm to native plants and crops and damage that you don't intend to do. It's bad. I've seen what happens when invasive species treatments go wrong, and it's not very good press. Nothing from anything I ever did, but from what I've heard from other places. So there's a number of things that we'll do with herbicides. We'll do foliar treatments, so we'll spray the plant, typically the backpack sprayer and invasive species control. So we're actually spraying the leaves of the plant with a surfactant and an herbicide. That has the most potential to cause drift and damage off-site, so you have to be very careful with foliar spraying. Cut stumping is very nice because what we're simply doing is cutting the shrub, applying herbicide on the shrub, and there's no spray. So the potential for damage off-site is very low with cut stump applications. We'll also do basal spraying, where we'll actually treat the bottom about 12 to 16 inches of a shrub with an oil and herbicide, and we'll spray the trunk, let the plant die, and then we'll go remove it later. That's also less potential for off-site drift. And then with things such as Japanese knotweed, we can actually use injectors. But the problem with injectors are, if you have thousands of stems, it's very time-consuming. So now we'll talk a little bit about the invasive species themselves. And I always ask, is kudzu a threat to Michigan? The answer is yes, because we've actually discovered kudzu in Michigan. It is the plant that ate the South, and this is a site that I found in Berrien County. They're very big, purple flowers. They can have 6-foot sections of roots that weigh over 400 pounds. They spread, they're voracious. It's a very nasty plant. And this is a plant that I discovered in Berrien County that survived that polar vortex we had a few years ago. So it did not kill it off. I couldn't believe I found kudzu. I thought I was seeing things, but this is actually on DNR-owned property in Berrien County. But as I mentioned earlier, the early detection rapid response, we found it fast, we treated it, and I believe it's actually gone now. I haven't been to the site because I don't work in Berrien County anymore. But it's nice when we find these things very early because we can treat them very fast and eradicate them. And the funny thing is we actually found 2 more sites that month of a species that we didn't think was in Michigan. But that's the site right there. It was just covering a tree line on the edge of a road on some DNR property, or DNR managed property, and then we eventually treated it. Next up is giant hogweed. Now I get calls about this every single spring because often you'll see news reports about giant hogweed and everybody freaks out. And I have treated giant hogweed. There was a site I treated in Branch County. But we have a pretty good idea where all the hogweed is in the state of Michigan. We've done really good on outreach on hogweed. We don't know everything, but we do a pretty good job of treating hogweed. And this is a big member of the carrot family. Gets around 10 feet tall. Has a big white flower on it. It's called an umbel. It looks like an umbrella. They have really big flowers. And the reason that we really worry about giant hogweed is it's a public health concern. It causes photodermatitis, so if you get hogweed sap on you, you can have this type of burning reaction. I have heard anecdotes of people having permanent blindness, lesions, and this can be painful for several years after you come in contact with giant hogweed. We really like to educate on this so the public's aware of it, and because we don't want kids playing around giant hogweed. That could be very bad. And what happens is whenever that sap gets on your skin, whenever it has a reaction with the sun like poison ivy, it's very painful. So this is one of the top species that we educate about, and I'll show you a picture of the hogweed that I treated. And there are some natives that often get confused for giant hogweed, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But when I'm looking for giant hogweed, I'm looking obviously for these giant, big, sharp leaves. And when I know it's hogweed, there's purple splotches and spikes on the stems. The natives don't have that purple coloring in them. So if you see something that looks like hogweed, you can send me a picture. I can tell you right away if it's hogweed or not. The one time I got a report about hogweed, I didn't believe the guy. It ended up being hogweed, so I take every single inquiry serious now. Because I think I saw a stat that 98% of the time we get calls for hogweed, it's cow parsnip. But the one time I didn't believe the guy, it was true, so that's how I operate now. So as I said, this is one that will crowd out native areas, but the big problem with giant hogweed is the public health concern. I always butcher how this is pronounced, but it has carcinogenic phenylocamerins, I think it's called. That's the sap. And as a carcinogen, it's cancer-causing. And when I've treated this, I've used Garlon 3A, which is a trade name for triclopyr. I've also treated it with Roundup, Rodeo, it's a wetland-approved mix. And I've had good success treating giant hogweed with those two chemicals. That's the treatment that I had from the first time. As you see, there are some survivors in here. So follow-up treatments may be necessary, and this is something you're going to want to monitor for a number of years. It's not a one-and-done deal when you spray giant hogweed and most invasive species in general. As I mentioned, there are some things that look like giant hogweed. The most common misreported giant hogweed would be cow parsnip. And the difference really is they look very similar in the same family. Usually they're a little bit shorter, but cow parsnip has a green stem with some white fuzzy hairs. There's no purple on it. So that's the main thing I'm looking at is, does it look like hogweed, but it has no purple on the stem? It's cow parsnip. Purple stem angelica is often mistaken for giant hogweed. That's found in fens and wetlands, very common to see in the spring. And then poison hemlock, which is poisonous. It can kill you if you eat it. Poison hemlock is from Europe, also an invasive, but it's kind of naturalized here, unfortunately. That's poisonous. That can cause you to have burns. They're all in the same type of family, but they're not as dangerous as giant hogweed because giant hogweed burns are far more severe. This is the cow parsnip. As you can see, no purple on the stem, just some fuzzy hairs, but it looks very similar to cow parsnip, but it's not an invasive species. Now this is wild parsnip. You'll see this a lot of times on the roads when you're in northern Michigan around Gaylord, going north on the highway. Up in the Upper Peninsula too, there's quite a bit of this. This is also a plant that can burn your skin. And I actually found a site in Hillsdale County this spring checking on our properties. So it is in southern Michigan. Again, it has the umbels, like the giant hogweed, but it's very small. They're only 4 to 5 feet tall. Yellow flowers. This is something you need to be very careful of when you're pulling plants. Make sure that you're not dealing with yellow parsnip. It's not as common down here, but I'm starting to see a bit more of it. And as I said, when you drive up north in the summer, you'll see a lot of this stuff on the highway driving through northern Michigan. Oriental bittersweet, this is one that my goat's working on right now. This stuff's very nasty. It can really destroy the quality of a woodland. And Oriental bittersweet can get very gigantic. Some of the vines I've observed, they get about that thick or bigger. They'll strangle trees and kill them. They'll really affect the quality of your woodlot. And I will often use goats on bittersweet because it's really hard to get in these areas because there's so much vines in the way. I let the goats go through and eat the bittersweet. I follow up with some cut stunt treatments, and then I will follow up next year with the goats and just remove the bittersweet over time. There is a native bittersweet. I've only seen it once in my life, but as you can see the difference, the berries of the native bittersweet are on the ends of the stems, whereas the invasive, the berries are all along the stem. The problem is that this invasive one will hybridize and ruin the genetic viability of our natives, and the big reason that we really remove the bittersweet is because, as you can see here, it gets quite large. It strangles and pulls down a lot of trees. I have to deal with this on my farm. I've had a lot of trees get pulled down by bittersweet on my fence lines, so it's something that I'm very cognizant of because it's a pain. I don't want to fix fences. I don't want trees coming down. Do you have a question?
I just was going to comment that this is one invasive that's really decreasing the biodiversity here at Woldumar. So just wanted to...
Yeah. And this is one I really focus on because it's probably the most annoying invasive species I deal with. My farm is full of invasive species. I'm working on that right now. But I'd say that my property is probably about the worst of any property I've been to. I'd hate to admit that, but it's true. So these are the goats that I've used in the past. I worked for the Southwest by Southwest Corner SISMA, cooperative invasive species management areas. I won't talk about them too much, but we are partners in those cooperatives. They're supported by the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, and they're often headquartered in conservation districts. And they're just cooperatives of organizations that treat and manage invasive species. We are partners ourselves as MMLC for the local SISMA here and all the SISMAs in the areas that we covered. But I worked for a SISMA before, that's why I deal with invasive species. And these are the goats that we got. And as you can see, we released them, and in about 5 days, they've completely defoliated the understory of that park. That's Plum Lake County Park in St. Joseph County. Very beautiful park. They have a nice prairie, and then the woodlands that they had are completely Oriental bittersweet. So we didn't have enough manpower. They worked for free, and they loved their job. So we just put them out there, and they just spent the entire summer out eating Oriental bittersweet. Tree of Heaven, I said I'd talk about really rare invasive species, but this one's very common. And there's a reason I'm talking about tree of heaven, is because there's another invader that's coming that loves tree of heaven. It's called the spotted lanternfly. So tree of heaven is something that we're monitoring now because we want to observe to see if spotted lanternflies are here. But it's been here since the 1700s. Smells like rotten peanut butter, grows very fast. Most commonly observed by its compound leaves and these little leaf scars that you can see here. Kind of look at little hearts. But tree of heaven is something that is a strong preference for spotted lanternfly because it's from their native homeland. But tree of heaven's pretty common, especially in cities. And the best way to distinguish it from like sumacs are when I'm looking at the leaves, there'll be little glands on the underside of the leaves. They also have these twisty seed pods that can kind of have like a purplish, sometimes orange appearance, but in the winter you'll actually see these seed pods still on the tree of heaven. But tree of heaven is something that, as I said, we're starting to monitor now because we're trying to look out for these spotted lanternflies. And as you can see here, that's the seed pods in the winter, and that's the nice orange color you can see in the spring and summer. But that's how I'm typically looking for tree of heaven when I'm driving by the side of the road. I'm looking for those clusters of seeds. We do have the native sumac, most commonly mistaken for tree of heaven. Not poison sumac, those are found in wetlands. But staghorn sumac is a very similar looking species because it has compound leaves. But what I'm looking for is it has a fuzzy stem, and in the late summer they will typically have these giant red cones which you can actually make tea out of. But that's what I'm looking at when I'm driving the side of the road. Are there seed clusters, or am I looking at these little seed, I don't know what they call them, the cones on the side. That's the difference I'm looking at when I'm looking for species. I spend too much time looking for invasive species on the side of the road. And unfortunately, after I've had this job as a SISMA coordinator, I can never go anywhere beautiful ever again without looking for invasives. It's kind of a little curse, but it's something I'm always on the lookout for no matter where I'm at. There's invasive species. So the spotted lanternfly, this is a presentation that I had made a few years ago. I had to update it last night because there are spotted lanternflies that have been detected in Michigan now in the southeast part of the state. They found some dead ones, and I think they might have even found some egg masses. But this is something that we're going to have to start dealing with. Their favorite food, tree of heaven. Then they like grapevines. So if you like wine, this is a big deal for our wine industry. So they're really concerned about it on the lakeshore of Michigan. And then they like walnuts and fruit trees. So the problem with these guys is they can kill your fruit trees. There's also other things that they do that annoy people, especially laying egg masses. So they spread very quickly because they lay their egg masses on any hard surface they can find. They believe they came to the United States from marble shipments. They just lay their eggs on them, and then boom, they're in the United States. So this is what their life cycle looks like. As you can see, the adults there in the corner, they have a few nymph stages, and I want to show you what their egg masses look like. They have this kind of like gray goo that they'll lay on hard surfaces. That's the egg mass of the spotted lanternfly. So if you do find these guys, alert your SISMA, but also you'll want to alert Michigan Department of Ag, because this is a big deal for our ag industry, are these spotted lanternflies. And some little tips when you're looking for them. They excrete honeydew when they're feeding on plants. So when this honeydew is excreted, be on the lookout for a lot of wasp activity or ants around your fruit trees. There may be honeydew excreted by the spotted lanternflies. So if you all of a sudden notice there's a lot of wasps and ants by your trees, take a look. And that honeydew is something that's going to really annoy municipalities and people, because when they start feeding on these trees, you're going to get all the sticky honeydew on your vehicles, on the sidewalks. It's going to be a problem for municipalities. Next up is Japanese knotweed. And this is one I treated a lot. I hate treating it because it's so tall and it's just kind of a pain. I hate Japanese knotweed. But this is what they call Michigan bamboo. It resembles bamboo, but it's not from the same family. And this one's really a big invasive species because 2/3 of the plant is in the ground, but they get about 10 feet tall. I find these a lot in cities, disturbed areas. Japanese knotweed is pretty prevalent in the state of Michigan. And this is the one that concerns people because it can actually impact the viability of parking lots, the roadways. It doesn't break concrete, but the root system and the growth of the plant can ruin its integrity, and then you get a lot of Japanese knotweed in a lot of abandoned parking lots. So this is one that municipalities can't stand because they do a good job of destroying asphalt. And Japanese knotweed in its homeland is not a problem. It's often the first plant that comes up when volcanic activity happens, and Japan's very known, it's in the Ring of Fire, a lot of volcanoes. So in Japan, it's not invasive because they have insects that feed on it, And it's a plant that grows up very quickly, but it's often replaced, 20, 30 years later by other native plants in Japan. And again, it's very strong because it involved in volcanic areas. I often find it on roadsides, ditches. I often find it spreading through people's yards after they mow it. Anywhere that's been disturbed, construction sites are another big one. I've even had people have it introduced from construction companies that have it in their fill piles. I saw a gentleman that had a brand new septic system, not cheap. They brought in fill dirt with Japanese knotweed seeds in it, stems, and boom, he had Japanese knotweed growing on his new septic system. He was not happy. This is from a construction site in Benton Harbor. As you can see, it's coming out through the storm drains. And these are really annoying to deal with because it takes about 3 to 5 years of treatments to kill it. Mowing it spreads it very easily. It only takes a fingernail-sized piece of the stem or the nodes to spread the plant. So this one is often spread through mismanagement. The rhizomes can be dormant for up to 20 years in the soil. We believe it's allelopathic from research, so it's actually emitting chemicals in the ground to prevent other plants from growing. And the thing that really ticks people off is it's a damage to concrete pavement infrastructure. This is the worst thing you want to see with Japanese knotweed. Do not mow it. The best time to treat Japanese knotweed is before a first frost. I often treat it with milestone. I will also use Roundup. It depends on the situation, because this stuff grows about a few inches a day, and it can reach a few feet tall in the spring. So what I will do, if it's in an area that's not like a right-of-way or a spot where it's a visibility concern, I'll treat Japanese knotweed when it's about 3 or 4 feet tall to knock it back, and then I'll come back in the fall and treat it again. If it's an area that's not a problem, I will wait till late summer, fall to treat it. A lot of people don't like doing that because they hate looking at it, but what we're trying to do is, when this plant goes dormant in the winter, all its energy is going back into the ground and its root system. We treat it at that time because we know that herbicide is going into the soil where its roots are. So again, this is one you typically wait to treat in the fall, and then when you drive around the countryside, you see a lot of this. People see it, they mow it, they spread it, which is the most unfortunate thing. And as I said, the big problem we deal with Japanese knotweed, and I know there's a site down this road here if you want to see it live, the damage to the asphalt and concrete. So it's actually been in Britain quite a bit longer than the United States. They actually have it growing inside houses in some spots. It's a very tough plant, and this is a nightmare for people who own homes. So we want to really control Japanese knotweed populations. And as I mentioned, it grows very fast. This is the first month of my employment in the SISMA back in 2017. That's all the dead stems that you find in the winter. And then that's a couple weeks later. So it grows very fast, outcompetes the native plants, and really establishes itself. As I said, we typically will treat it with imazapyr, which you need to be very careful about, because imazapyr translocates the roots of other trees very easily. This is a very dangerous herbicide if you're not careful with it. We use glyphosate, and I use milestone, often on Japanese knotweed, and as I mentioned, we treat this typically late summer, early fall. The most common misidentifications for Japanese knotweed are pokeweed, which looks very close to it, but it's not. Red bud saplings look a lot like young Japanese knotweed. And then lizard's tail, I've got calls about that before. Lizard's tail is a nice wetland plant, really cool plant too. But those are found typically on stream banks, which can be very close to, yes?
I was going to say, and also catalpas when they're younger.
Yes, that's a good point. Catalpa looks a lot like Japanese knotweed. And in fact, I've driven by, observed catalpa and Japanese knotweed together, and I was confused. And I'm glad you brought that up. Catalpa trees look a lot like Japanese knotweed. Phragmites. This is one that was brought over from the Black Sea area, I believe, through ballast discharge in the Great Lakes. The east side of the state is completely infested with Phragmites, and we got quite a bit here. In fact, I was looking at a property last week that might be donated to us, and it was a giant Phragmites infestation, which is unfortunate. This stuff is really bad for biodiversity. There is a native Phragmites as well, and I'll show you that in a minute. So the problem with Phragmites is it spreads through stolons, which are basically above ground roots. It has a really strong root system, takes about 5 years to eradicate, and as I highlighted there, every foot of Phragmites lowers property value by about $1. People like to buy lake homes. They don't want to stare outside and look at reeds. They like to see the lake. This stuff can get up to 15 feet tall in extreme cases. Waterfowl don't really prefer Phragmites. The only species I ever really find in abundance are red-winged blackbirds. they seem to love Phragmites. But wetlands are very important habitats and ones that MMLC likes to protect. We don't want to find Phragmites because it ruins the biodiversity of those wetlands. Also, keep in mind that you can burn Phragmites, doesn't control it, but burning the thatch is really helpful. But you need to be careful because Phragmites fires are extremely hot, and I've seen plenty of photos of burnt boathouses and homes that have had some melting issues because they burned Phragmites too close. It's an extremely hot burn. So there is a native Phragmites, there is the invasive one. And it's hard for me to tell a lot of times, but the invasive one is typically a darker green. The natives are a lighter shade they're more of a yellow green. When I'm looking to tell the difference, I look at the bottom of the stems. The natives will typically have a red streak about the first foot or two of the plant. The invasive ones have a sheath on the outside. They don't have that red streak. The invasives will often have a more purple seed coloration on their seed heads, and they're also a lot fluffier. The native is not nearly as fluffy. They don't have a purple color to them. Native Phragmites is starting to decline, and we're getting a lot more invasive Phragmites that have really taken over wetlands. Typically, if you're in a site and you see some Phragmites you're not sure about and it has very small seed heads, I'm looking around to make sure that it's not a monoculture of Phragmites. If it's not, you're likely dealing with the natives. But beware, just because the site doesn't look sinister doesn't mean it's not invasive. This is a very early invasion of invasive Phragmites, and it's not really sinister when it first invades. But this is the best time to control it so you're not walking through 15-foot plants that cover an acre or more. In this situation, I'd probably hand swipe this. I wouldn't foliar spray because I can walk by with a cotton glove and I can swipe these and I can go on my way without spraying near that water. And that's another method that I've used before. And then this is the last species I'll talk about because I'd be cognizant of your time. But this is black and pale swallowworts. This is an invasive species that we removed off our Bunker Nature Preserve in Mason. This is a species that we really worry about because it impacts monarch butterfly populations. What happens is the monarch butterflies assume these are milkweeds. They will lay their eggs on them, but the larvae, this does not have the right nutrition to support monarchs, and they will die. So we really try to remove these. Oftentimes I find these in abandoned old hayfields. Sometimes I'll find them in residential yards, but old hayfields are a very common sight. And these pictures, like when you find these, their flowers are very small, and they don't show up in the first year. So don't use that as the indicator. But what I'm looking for is if I'm seeing a kind of an older established site, it's going to have these little dark or pale stars, five-pointed. And this is another species, I think that's from like the Ukrainian Black Sea area. But this is a vine. Has really dark, glossy lanceolate leaves. And this one I always like to warn people about because it's toxic to horses and livestock. You don't want to bale this up in your hay. You don't want your animals feeding on this because it can impact their rate of gain, the function. I think it can even poison some animals, especially horses are really susceptible, from my understanding, to swallowworts. And as I mentioned, with the monarch butterfly being on the endangered species list now, this is something I really look for on our properties when we're managing them. They're coated, they have really strong coating on their leaves that really resist herbicides, so I like to use surfactants, and you don't want to spray them too soon. Swallowworts are something you want to wait. They emerge in May, but you want to wait for them and treat them later in the summer. And I've done a really good job treating them with triclopyr. I like triclopyr because it doesn't hurt grass. It's specific to broadleaf plants. Glyphosate works as well. If you don't have the desire to use herbicides, you can actually cut the seed pods that form on these to prevent them from spreading. And you can mow them several times per year before the seed pods form, but you got to be very careful about cleaning your mowers and being cognizant of that. So I don't really recommend mowing. I recommend spraying them. But if you don't feel like spraying or you don't want to, at least taking and cutting the seed pods off, bagging them, and disposing of them is a way to keep this species from spreading. Now, if you see invasive species, there's a site called MISSIN, which is run by the state of Michigan, Michigan State as well. You can actually report GPS locations of invasive species. If you're traveling, you can actually use this app to find out, so is there hogweed by my property? You can get on this website, you can look, and any infestation that's been reported, you can just check on the map, make sure you can actually track the populations of these species. They have an app. I've reported hundreds of invasive species on it, and it has also a nice educational component to it where you can teach yourself about natives and invasives. But when I find invasive species, especially rare ones, I'll report on missing. If you have something like nutria or something that's not been detected in Michigan yet, someone from Michigan State will probably contact you to make sure, just to verify that it's a true report. I saw a nutria report up in the Upper Peninsula a few years ago. It was a beaver. Then they investigated it. But the point is, someone will check with you when you're reporting something that's not very common. So this is my last slide, and we'll go outside and meet the part of my crew. So if you ever need to protect your property, if you ever want to protect your property through a conservation easement, if you ever want more information on our natural areas to go visit, feel free to contact me at any time at my email. I'm Executive Director of Mid-Michigan Land Conservancy, so we're always interested in efforts to protect properties. We work very closely with a lot of partners on land protection and educational programs, and we want the public to know that you're very welcome to use our properties to go recreate. We have a lot of birders that use our properties, especially our bunker preserve in Mason. We had pelicans out there this year. We had a lot of birders out there, and we have a really nice prairie out there that we manage. And we're always looking to acquire more properties. We want to make sure that everyone has access to natural areas. So at this time, we'll go outside. I have one of my crew here that's working on bittersweet right now. We'll go talk really quickly about browsing invasive species with goats. Come on out. Come on, Jinx.
He is very cute.
Yeah, and you can pet him. So we use goats because, for one, they do a very good job. I was hoping to bring my big guys today, but my trailer lights weren't working, so I can bring them another time. But my big goats are about 150 pounds or larger. He was born this June. And we use goats because they can get in areas where a lot of machinery can't. They're often cheaper. And they do a phenomenal job of removing invasive species. And I mentioned they have 4-chambered stomachs that don't spread invasive seeds. And they love the job. They love eating brush. Goats are browsers. We use sheep as well, but they're typically grazers. Their preferred food sources are any shrubs. That's their favorite thing to eat. He's actually a pack goat, so he's being trained for hunting and camping. But I also use goats for removing invasive species. So he's bottle fed. If you want goats for invasive species treatments, I don't recommend bottle feeding because you need to bottle feed them 3 times a day for a month, and it's very time consuming. If you just want goats for removing invasives, let their mom take care of them. Just because I love them, but it's a lot of time bottle feeding. And when you have multiple ones, it can be quite a chore for your whole spring is pretty much feeding baby goats. But I used to run a team of these guys. He's only 3.5 months old. And taking care of goats it should be pretty simple, but there are some things to be aware of. I give them Clostridium shots when they're 30, 60, and 90 days old. That protects them from bacteria in the soil, and it has a tetanus in there, so if he scratches himself or hurts himself, he won't get tetanus. And I check them every 6 months to make sure they're not getting worms, because when they're out doing their job, especially getting their mouth on the soil, they will accumulate worms, and that can degrade their quality over a period of time, and is one of the most dangerous things for goats is worms. So every 6 months I check. He's only 3.5 months old, so he hasn't been checked yet. But I leave the horns on my goats. You don't have to do that. I do it because this is a goat that's meant for hiking, and the horns help dissipate heat when they're hiking. So when I don't like to take the horns off my goats, but my bigger goats have horns that are about that big, and I don't do it for show. I do it it's for his health when he's hiking. And but when we're doing goat removal, I recommend using females or weathered males. His father, I can tell when fall's coming because I can smell him from my house. And what they do is the ladies, they think the ladies like it, and they must, because there's goats, there's lots of goats. They will pee on their faces all fall to attract the females. So I don't recommend using buck goats for invasive species removal. And if you have a small property, I don't recommend keeping bucks on your property because they smell. So typically, what I'll do is I use females. They do a phenomenal job. And then the weathered goats when they're castrated. This guy is a buck. I castrate later than most people because I want to make sure that he's growing because of urinary calculi, which is a problem of male goats when they get older. they can get urinary stones that cost a lot of money to treat, or it can kill them. So I castrate my bucks around 5 or 6 months. If you don't want to deal with stinky bucks and male goats, how they act, I recommend castrating them much younger than that. But because I wait just to make sure that he's fully developed, and it decreases that chance of him having urinary stones. So that's typically the care of my goats. I feed them hay only. I feed the females some grain when they're pregnant and after they're pregnant because they need some support. But male goats, and I'm not telling you how to raise goats, that's just what I do. There's other ways to do it. I typically just feed them grass hay in the winter, shrubs in the summer and fall, and then back in the spring, they're back out in the pastures, out eating shrubs and enjoying their life as a goat. Typically what I do is I'll buy, and I'm going to buy some for next year, is I'll have electric net fencing. Is what we do. So we'll come in like a site right here, like when I had my Sysma goats. We come through and we clear the trail of wooden debris, and we'd run fences in this area. So we do I don't remember the acre, like maybe 1/8 of an acre. And then we'd release the goats in there, we'd leave them for a week, we come back and take care of them. As far as care goes, I mentioned the CD and T shots are important, they're young. You do those once a year. And then I just like to check their hooves every month to make sure they're not growing in a way that can inhibit them. Because their hooves grow really fast when they're not raised on concrete or any rocky environments. Because in the wild, goats' hooves are always worn down. When we use them for invasive species control, their hooves aren't getting worn. So I check them every time I go out to look at them. As far as predator goes, I've never had any issues with predators ever. The fences keep the predators out. And this guy's very small. These things get gigantic. Mine are probably about this tall right now. They can get up to, I've seen goats get up to 300 pounds. They are not small, and they can handle themselves very well. They don't really need to have water. I provide them some water in the summer, but they're getting most of the water from the plant material that they're eating. And think of them almost like camels. They don't really need a lot of water. And then I will also provide them a loose mineral to make sure that they're growing healthy and that they're getting, especially in Michigan, we're selenium deficient. I like to make sure that the goats are actually getting some mineralization when they're out doing their job. But if you want to do this on your property, keeping goats is not exactly cheap. If you're going to hire goats in, you're going to pay about $20 a goat a day or a few hundred a week, but it is cheaper than renting machinery and having somebody come out. If you do small scale projects, goats do a great job. If you're just working on your property and you don't want to have a business, you can keep a few goats. I believe 3 will clear an acre in 3 weeks is typically the numbers that I'm seeing. Out west, they're using these guys to remove brush to manage for brush fires, and they'll actually mob graze goats. They'll bring out hundreds of goats and toss them out in acres, and 400 goats will clear an acre in a couple days, like completely devoid of plants. But the great thing about these guys is they don't need to be paid. Their payment is food. They love scratches. They're very docile, and they do a very phenomenal job of removing invasive species. This guy's should be eating bittersweet, but he's taken to this raspberry. But so like I said, when you're thinking of the site that you're clearing, make sure you don't have endangered plants or anything that you have to worry about, because these guys are going to eat everything. But in areas that are really impacted by invasive species, like out there, that would be a beautiful spot to throw goats on, because they could work on that all day, and they do a phenomenal job. Something is to keep in mind too, and when you're using goats, you got to be very careful of wetland areas, because there are some worms that white-tailed deer will transmit to goats that can kill them. So I typically won't use goats in wetland areas. Number one, goats really don't like water. That's the big challenge of using pat goats, is you have to train them to get over their fear of crossing water. That's usually involves taking them swimming when they're young. I haven't done that yet. But so goats, I don't recommend using them for invasives in wetland areas, just because of the worms and the potential, because they just don't like water. As I mentioned, this guy, and you can feel free to come pet him. He's very friendly. He's more bonded to humans than he is goats. But he will be joining the big guys soon. I just have him in his own sequestered area, because they're 150, 160 pounds, and he's like 40. So, and goats can be territorial, but overall, for invasive species, they're a pleasure to work with. They love their job, and they're always happy to see you. And it's just always a joy, and it's nice because you can get them fed for free. You remove invasive species, and it's better overall for your woodlot or your property. And they're very fun to raise. They do have their moments when they escape, and and do things like that, but overall they're a real joy.
Also free fertilizer.
Yeah, and free fertilizer.
Do you have a program where, say I get a call at the SISMA and they're interested in goats for their property, I should direct them your way? Like, do you have a program that way? Or
I'm thinking about in the future.
Okay.
These goats are a bit more on the higher end side of quality. I'm not saying use bad goats, but these are goats that I got from Idaho. They're from pack stock. You can, and the nice thing about goats and invasive species, you don't have to go out and buy a $500 goat. You can find a $100 goat, $50 goat. They do just as well. I would be open to doing that in the future with your SISMA though, because I have a number of goats, and
I got one call this year about goats
Okay.
and invasive species, and that was my first time hearing of
Yeah.
goats being used. And so when I got to know about this, I really wanted to come out.
Yeah, so next time I'll probably bring my big guys. But what we would do is we put the big guys out there and they defoliate that in a few days, and then we could go out there and remove the stems. But he's only 40 pounds, and they grow really immense in their first year. His mom was 100 pounds at 6 months old. She was a giant, and she looks just like him. But these are, like I said, these are for camping and hunting. So these guys are going to the Porkies next year, and we're going to go hike. They'll have their packs on, but they don't carry weight on their backs until they're 4 years old. And they grow till about age 3 or 4. So he's still very, very little, but he's going to be a monster when he's older. The goats work well, and I'll let you know how it works out, but I actually have Texas Longhorns, and I'll be experimenting with them this year to see how they do on buckthorn and autumn olive, because Texas Longhorns are adapted to brushy areas of South Texas. They come from, cattle that came from Spain and North Africa, so they're used to eating very, sparse areas. So Longhorns will actually eat browse and brush and shrubs much more than cattle will, because most cattle breeds are typically grazers. They will eat brush, but Longhorns are different. So next year, hopefully I'll have some experience. Maybe I can bring a Longhorn, because I have some big ones. But I'm actually going to be using Longhorns to try out on bittersweet, autumn olive, and I have a buckthorn site that I want to clear and install native vegetation. So animals, again, they're fun to have, and they can do a really good job on invasive species management. I ran 7 goats. The only issue that I had is I didn't have enough fence. So they actually did too good of a job where I'd have to come move them every 3 or 4 days because I had too many goats on the area. So that's something to keep in mind too, is don't have too many or you'll spend your whole summer waking up early and moving goats. You want to really be careful about that, because it took a lot of my time up that I didn't plan on doing because they did too good of a job. I should have probably cut the numbers I had in half on the amount of fence I had at a time when I was using the SISMA goats. But again, it's a good problem to have. They do too good of a job. But when you're doing goats, make sure you're using them in a way that you don't have too many of them, or you're going to spend a lot of time moving them. That's my recommendation, just from experience. But are there any questions in general before I put them back up about goats or invasive species, or anything I might have glossed over, or the use of goats? Any questions?
We were having a debate a week or two ago. I think we know the answer, but they're useful also for things like poison ivy. Right?
Yeah, that's actually one of the main reasons one of the primary reasons they started using goats is because it was tough for crews to get in and treat invasive species, because they were going to these spots that had a bunch of poison ivy. So they let the goats go in and remove the poison ivy for the humans, and then the humans came in and treated the invasive species. But they do such a good job eating the invasives too, that we just use them for both purposes. But it's nice, is they will eat the poison ivy. You have to be careful, because they will transmit it to you, because there's the West Michigan SISMA had a goat team on the Grand River for a while, and they were on a public trail, so people would go pet them and they would get poison ivy from them. Yeah, because the goats are just covered in poison ivy. So the West Michigan SISMA used them for a while. We ran them for a bit, but they are very expensive. But I'd be happy to possibly bring my big guys out at some point. And try them out. I won't bring the bucks though, because they smell. But like I said, the females do a great job. And then, like I said, I'll run through their care real quick before we start moving invasives. But as I mentioned, when they're born, I give them their CED&T shot for tetanus and Clostridium at 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. And then I watch for coccidia, like in a puppy. You just got to watch and make sure they're not getting scours or diarrhea when they're little. Because when they're little, their immune systems aren't quite up to snuff yet. And then, like I said, I check them every 6 months for parasites, just to make sure they're not getting a worm load that can affect their body. And then I don't dehorn mine, but they usually do that early. I don't dehorn mine, like I said, because they're for hiking, and I like the look, and I'm not worried about it. My longhorns have 7 feet horns. The goat horns don't bother me at all, and I've never been injured by them. So you're not going to find many horned goats in the state of Michigan. There's a lot of 4-H, I think, doesn't allow horned goats, I think. But actually, these goats, they actually have packing courses now that are starting to become a common 4-H clubs. They're using pack goats for obstacles, and it's a new growing class in 4-H. But as I mentioned, I'm getting off topic again. The 3 shots I give them, and again, I'm not telling you how to take care of them. This is what I do. 30, 60, 90 days, I'll give them their shots. Then they get 1 every year. So goats don't like shots. When I give them their shots, they can sometimes they hold grudges. I wormed his uncle the other day, and he wouldn't forgive me for a few hours. So when I give him shots, I like to make sure that you give them love. You let them know that you didn't mean to hurt them. It wasn't you. It was the needle. And I just give them a lot of scratches and pets, and they usually will come around within a couple minutes. But they will hold grudges if you hurt them. They remember it. But other than that, those things, I watch out for goat polio. It's because goats, when they get stressed or have you separate them from their mother, a stressful event, their thiamine, their vitamin B will drop in their brain, and they can succumb to it. So I will keep vitamin B on hand just to make sure that they're not getting stressed. But I'm telling you all the bad things that can happen to goats.
All use vitamin.
Yeah. But typically there's no issues, and I didn't have a single issue that entire summer with the goats when they were on bittersweet. I was more worried about humans messing around with them than I was any animals, because they were at a park where there was a lot of people, teenagers goofing around at night. I was more worried about people messing with the fence of the goats, but fortunately we didn't have any issues. But that's goats, and again, I'd be happy to bring the big guys at some point in the future so I can show you on some more brush. The big guys do a really good job. I had him in there for 40 minutes. He did a decent job, but he's pretty tubby. He gets a lot of hay right now that he's growing, but if I brought out my big guys, I could have them defoliate the entire area in a couple days. It would be devoid of plants. But any other questions before we get started on removal?
Can I take him home?
Yeah, he's a cute one.
Very cute.
Good luck. He's a crier when
Yeah.
Dad's not around.
Yeah, that's the only. And I used to take him shopping with me. I'm training him to follow me in the wilderness, so I would take him to the farm store. He'd follow you like a dog, off leash. Now that he's getting a little bigger, he's more worried about food than me, so he doesn't follow me quite as closely. But he'll be trained the next 4 years to be a wilderness goat, and along with his uncles that are much bigger. And I was going to use his mom, but I'm going to not use her as a pack goat just because I don't want their udders getting scratched and damaged in the wilderness. But female goats make great pack goats because if you like milk in your coffee when you're out hunting in the wilderness or camping, it's nice to have a goat there with you. But I typically just use castrated males for hiking, and the bucks stay in my pastures. They smell in the fall, but they stop doing that in the winter and summer, thank the Lord, because it's, like I said, it's kind of overwhelming at times. Good boy.
There's a woman who walks the Crooked Lake Trail in Pinckney, and she has her 2 goats,
Does she?
and they're all packed down with things as she walks.
Yeah, and they don't have to be just used for hunting. A lot of people take them just camping or fishing. And it's nice because I like backpacking, but I also like hiking with them carrying all my camp gear. And but just don't put all your stuff on one goat in case something happens. If they get lost or something, you don't want your tent and all your supplies on one animal. But yep, that's the gist of using goats. They do a phenomenal job. And again, I'd be happy to show you the big guys some point in the future out here somewhere. I can bring the big guys next year in my trailer, and I can show you on bigger stuff, and they eat a lot more than this guy does.
I don't know, he's kind of put the hurt on some of this.
Right.
It's crazy. We had to like scoot him in the cage, so he's made great progress this morning.
Yeah. All of our stuff in our yard was trimmed at goat height. Whenever the goats got out.
Yeah, and they're kind of like raptors, and they will get out if they can find any opportunity to, because they can leap over some pretty impressive stuff. But we'll get started on removal. I'll get him put back in. Come on, buddy.